I mentioned a minute ago, 2 weeks ago, finished a 15-week look or study at the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. And as we made our way through that book, we saw that Ecclesiastes explores life under the sun. And it exposes the ultimate bankruptcy of trying to find meaning and happiness, security and significance apart from God. And the philosophy teacher examined all of the various ways in which he tried to find security and happiness and meaning and purpose under the sun apart from God, and how he basically ran into dead ends at every turn. And he realized that if this is all that there is, and death is the end for all of us, then everything is meaningless. Nothing ultimately matters. You don't matter, I don't matter, what we accomplish doesn't matter, good things don't matter, bad things don't matter, nothing ultimately lasts. What we long for most is ultimately uncatchable. He says it's like chasing after the wind. If under the sun is all that there is, then we're all in big trouble. Bertrand Russell, who was a famous, well-known atheist from the end of the 19th century through the 20th century, understood this. It's amazing to me, and I'm going to talk about Christopher Hitchens here in a minute, but it's amazing to me how honest atheists can be, acknowledging or believing that they don't believe in the existence of God. They at least examine life for what it is, if in fact God does not exist. And Bertrand Russell captures this amazingly with these words that come from his book, Why I'm Not a Christian. He wrote, "Man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. No fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius, all are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of the universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built." He got it. In other words, without God, everything he just described is what we're left with. No hope, no meaning, no ultimate purpose. That apart from some major breakthrough, literally, apart from a glorious intrusion from above the sun, we are left, according to Russell, with the firm foundation of unyielding despair. Francis Schaeffer said that modern man has his feet firmly planted in midair. In other words, there's nothing to stand on. If this world is all that there is, and if under the sun is all that there is, without some major breakthrough from the other side, without some glorious intrusion from above the sun, that's what we're left with. Building your life on the firm foundation of unyielding, unrelenting despair. Realizing down deep that nothing ultimately matters. That we are, according to Russell, just a chance collection of accidental atoms. Nothing matters. There is no right, there is no wrong, there is no transcendent meaning to life. This is it. And that's why these verses are so unbelievably important. That's why, as we look ahead to Christmas and the radical incarnation of God's Son, when we think about the fact that the Creator of all, who spoke everything into existence, became Himself what He had made, taking on human flesh and frailties, taking on human weakness, enduring everything, Hebrews said, that we have endured, having to not only face temptation, but endure temptation in the same way that we do, yet was without sin. He came. He walked our path. He suffered the way we suffered, even more so, in taking on the punishment of the world. He suffered in ways that you and I have never suffered. This is what is so scandalous, in fact, blasphemous to other world religions about the Christian faith. The idea that God, high and holy, would become man, would take on human flesh, would become like you and me, is scandalous and blasphemous to most world religions. That the transcendent God would become immanent, would draw near, that Emmanuel would be true God with us, not simply God above us, but God with us, is something so radically counterintuitive that these verses become life-giving and liberating for those that, by God's grace, get it. John here announces that outside help has come. A rescuer from above the sun has arrived. Look at what he says in verse 1 and 2. He makes it very, very clear that the meaning of the universe, the word logos is used here for word, the meaning of the universe has come from above and beyond. And he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There is no mistaking that in verse 1, John is making the audacious claim that Jesus is in fact God. And Jesus himself claims in various places that he is God. And so, borrowing C.S. Lewis's statement formula, it's something we all have to face and deal with. He was either a lunatic, a madman running around saying he was God. There are a lot of those people in our world, you know, people who claim to be God. Or he was a liar, Lewis said, because he claimed to be God. Or he was in fact who he said he was, namely Lord. The one thing he cannot be is simply a good teacher, a moral reformer, because he claimed to be God, and if he claimed to be God and he was not in fact God, then he's not good, he's a liar. Or if he thinks he's God, really, but he's not, then he's a lunatic. You wouldn't call someone like that a good teacher. The one thing he's not is a good teacher. You're left with basically three options. He's either a madman, and in that case you can dismiss him outrightly, or he's a liar, in which case you shouldn't pay attention to anything he says, or he is in fact Lord, the creator of all. And John here tells us who Jesus is. And then he says in verse 2, he was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And so he speaks about this one who has created all things, this one above the sun. And then he says something radical in verse 14. This same word, he says, that I have just finished telling you about in verse 1, the creator, the sustainer of all things, the one who spoke all things into existence, the Lord of the universe, this same Lord, he says, became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. This glorious intrusion, this one who came to fulfill the promise originally made in Genesis chapter 3, that the seed of the woman would come one day and crush the head of the serpent. That there would one day come someone from above the sun who would clean up the mess we made, who would fix what we broke. God would have been, as I've mentioned before, perfectly just and right to leave us in the mess that we made. Genesis 1 and 2 make it very clear that everything God made was good. And it's not until Genesis chapter 3 where we decided on our own accord that we wanted to do it on our own, that life would be better if we could be our own God and call our own shots, that we broke every good thing God made. And it would have been perfectly okay, right, and just for God to leave us in the mess that we made. And instead, he makes this crazy promise, this amazingly gracious promise, that one day there would come one from above the sun who would clean up the mess we made, that the light of God would break through our darkness and fix everything we broke. And John here tells us he has come. This promise that was made in Genesis chapter 3 has been fulfilled. This prophecy of one who would come that Isaiah speaks about in various places is now here. He's arrived. He's come to set things straight, to make everything sad come untrue. This one has come. This glorious intrusion has happened. And notice verse 14, he didn't come to give us a self-help plan. He didn't come to provide us with a blueprint for better living or a to-do list. In fact, he came to save us from our self-help plans. He came to save us from our blueprints for better living. He came to save us from our to-do lists. That's the problem. This is the problem. Jesus did not come to say, listen, your plan isn't working, okay? But the Father and the Spirit and I have been working for a couple thousand years on a plan that if you would just simply abide by, I think you might be able to have your best life now, okay? So just follow me here, okay? Follow me here. That's what some people believe the Bible is. That's what many people inside the church believe Jesus came to do. You've heard me say this before. Jesus did not come to effect a moral reformation. He came to effect a mortal resurrection. Big difference. Moral reformations have happened and will happen apart from Jesus. Lots of people throughout history have effected moral reformations. Jesus did not come first to make bad people good, but dead people live. And so what we find here in verse 14 is that he didn't come to give us an improved self-help plan. He didn't come to give us a better blueprint for living or a to-do list. He came to save us from those things. The arrival, okay, This is why this is so scandalous. The arrival of God's rescuer from above the sun confronts our presumption that we can make it on our own. It assaults our assumption that we can save ourselves from loneliness and lostness, from despair and dejection. The arrival of Christ is God's shout that we can't make it on our own, and that every effort of ours to make it on our own is ultimately despairing, depressing, and it won't work. Look at verse 16 and 17. And from his fullness, this is, if I were to ever get a tattoo of a Bible verse, okay? Let me tell you, just this is a parenthetical statement, all right? But I might as well go ahead and confess it because I know some of you know about this. You've seen me with my shirt off, pool, beach, whatever, so you know this to be true. For those of you who haven't seen me with my shirt off, congratulations, okay? Consider yourself amongst the company of the blessed. I have a tattoo on my shoulder that my precious wife, Kim, purchased for me when we were both 19 years old, rebels without a cause. She bought it for me for Valentine's Day. It is by far the dumbest tattoo you've ever seen in your life, okay? Every morning, I am confronted with the stupidity and the permanency of stupidity when I was that age. Some of you can relate, I know. Well, anyway, I'm not going to show it to you, okay? It's on my shoulder, and it's a tattoo of a heart, okay, with a dagger going through it and a little blood dripping off the end of the dagger. It's the stupidest thing you've ever seen in your life. And there's a banner going over the heart, and it's supposed to either say mom or the name of your girlfriend or your wife or whatever. Mine remains blank to this day, all right? Much to the chagrin of my wife. She wondered at the time why I never put her name when we were just boyfriend, girlfriend. Before we were Christians, put my name in her tattoo, and I said, listen, you know, I mean, I like you, and I'm grateful for the tattoo, but there are no guarantees that we're going to even last another month. So I'm not plus, it was a pretty strategic thing for me to be able to use a black pen to put, you know, right inside my tattoo, whatever girl I was with at the time. It's remarkably impressive. Look, I put your name. I never did that. I'm just kidding, okay? Gee whiz. Anyway, if I were to ever muster up the courage and the physical strength, because it's painful, to put something in the blank space of my ridiculous tattoo, it would not be the name of my wife or my children, as much as I love them. It would be this verse. It's a long way around the bend of saying just how much I love John chapter 1, verse 16. If you're listening to me, okay, if you're sitting there, you're a teenager with your parents, you're like, but Mom, Dad, see, I've been begging you for a tattoo for a year, and, you know, Pastor's got one. Listen, I wish I didn't have one. Don't make a mistake. You'll regret it later, okay? There you go, parents. You can thank me later for discouraging all of your children to get a tattoo. Verse 16 blows my mind, and it says in one verse everything else the Bible says. Verse 16. You can summarize almost everything the Bible has to say about salvation for sinners, our desperation, God's deliverance, in one sentence. He says very plainly, and from His fullness, notice, not our fullness. This takes the spotlight off of us. It implies our emptiness, our inherent voidness. And it says in verse 16, and from His fullness, We have all received, not achieved, we have all received grace upon grace. It's the gospel in a nutshell. It implies our emptiness. It implies our voidness. It implies our desperation. It points to Christ, who embodies the fullness of God. It speaks of his amazing grace that extends to sinners like you and me. Outrageous mercy and amazing grace. It's not something we achieve. It's not something we work for. It's received. We are beggars in need of grace and mercy, and God, in the person of Jesus, comes, breaks through, and by his fullness extends grace upon grace. I remember John Piper once saying, and some of you have heard me say this before, how do you glorify a water fountain? You come thirsty and drink. This is what's going on here. How do you glorify God? You don't glorify God by bringing him imperfect gifts that you think are impressive to him. You glorify God by coming as a broken, desperate, weak, fallen, and frail person, saying, I can do nothing. I have nothing. Therefore, I need everything, all of your fullness, because I bring nothing to the table except unrighteousness, which makes Christ's righteousness absolutely necessary. You see, and notice verse 17, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. John's describing two different approaches here as we consider our need and what solution exists for our deep and desperate need. The law, there's a difference in the Bible, and Martin Luther said, you can't read the Bible rightly unless you can properly distinguish law and gospel. Both are good because both come from God, but both do very different things. And what the Bible makes it clear is that the law tells us what to do. And in one sense, that's a good thing because we're not left, scraping around in the dark, figuring out what God requires, what God demands. We're not left to our own devices to figure out for ourselves what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. The law is a gift in that it tells us what to do. But the gospel is the announcement of what God has done. So the law tells us what to do. The gospel tells us what God has done. The law tells us what God expects of us. The gospel tells us what God has done for us because we couldn't meet his expectations. Okay, big difference. We make a mess of the Bible and our lives when we confuse law and gospel. When gospel becomes law and law becomes gospel, we make a huge mess of our lives. We make a huge mess of our Bible reading when we can't properly distinguish these two things. The law serves us in this way. It reminds us that we're a lot worse than we think we are. We've talked about that a lot around here. The gospel tells us that God's grace is infinitely bigger than we could have ever imagined. The law is good in its relentless reminder that we can't do it. Some people say, that's not good news. I mean, in one sense, how can we call the law good if it's constantly reminding us that we can't pull it off, that we can't make it on our own, that we can't do it? And I mentioned 2 weeks ago, this is very true, that once you quit, you're free. once you stop depending on yourself to make it happen, you're free. Now you can truly live life to the fullest because you don't need from life those things that Christ alone can give you. And so now you're free. You're free to succeed. You're free to fail. You're free to win. You're free to lose. You're free. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, life without God is life without gospel. It's life under law. Because while the law is good in its relentless reminder that we can't do it, the gospel is good in its relentless reminder that Jesus did it for us. In other words, the law is a constant reminder of just how desperately we need the gospel. The law is a constant reminder that we can't make it on our own. We can't do it. We can't pull it off. The gospel is this great announcement that Christ pulled it off for us, that Christ did it for us, that from above the sun, one has come to do for people like you and me what we could never do for ourselves. As I mentioned, like I said a couple weeks ago, life without God is life without gospel. It's life on our own. It's life under law. The law of self-rescue, the law of self-actualization, the law which constantly says, it's up to you. You have to make it happen. And that's not simply a law, capital L, that we encounter when we read the Bible, but it's a law, lowercase l, that we experience internally and externally out there in our world. How many people do you know? How many people do I know that suffer under the weight of do more, try harder? If you're ever going to make something of your life, you have to do it on your own. That's what fuels all sorts of bad behavior. If you're going to ever feel validated, if you're ever going to feel justified, if you're ever going to feel like you matter, you have to do it. You have to make it happen. That's the law that we experience in the world. That's the voice inside, the voice which says your value is dependent on what you can do, on who you can become. So do more, try harder, make something of yourself. It's the voice that says you are responsible to establish your own identity. I mentioned a few minutes ago that Christopher Hitchens died this week. I don't know if you're familiar with who Christopher Hitchens is. He was a very outspoken, public intellectual, very smart, very witty, an atheist, unabashed atheist, wrote a number of books. His most controversial and probably his most famous book was one that came out about 4 years ago called God Is Not Great. The subtitle was How Religion Poisons Everything. And he went around the country debating other Christians. He was a remarkable debater, even though his reasoning was ultimately unsound. He was an audience capturer. He was remarkably witty and a great orator, and 18 months ago was diagnosed with cancer in his throat. And I followed what Christopher Hitchens, praying that something as despairing as inevitable death would be used by God to show him just his need and God's supply of that need in the person of Jesus. And ultimately, we don't know. We do know that his brother Peter was a Christian and an outspoken believer and very smart in his own right. We also know that Christian scientist and doctor Francis Collins was his primary doctor at the end of his life, and so he was surrounded by people, Christian people, who knew him and loved him. But he was a hard-hearted guy, as gifted as he was, and he died this past week, and I was surprisingly overcome with sadness when he passed away. There was nothing in me that was rejoicing. I was overcome with sadness. It was just another reminder to me that death is the inevitable end for all of us, that all of us could wake up tomorrow morning and face the bad news that we have something that we can't get rid of. We have 6 months to live, 18 months to live, 2 years to live, whatever. And so I was overcome with sadness. I got the news, I think it was Thursday night, maybe it was Wednesday night, whatever night he died. Got the news late that he had passed away, and went online and started reading a bunch of things that people were saying about him. And I read he was a writer for Vanity Fair magazine, as well as a number of other magazines, but I read his last piece where you need to go online and read it, just Christopher Hitchens' last Vanity Fair piece, you can Google it. It is so unbelievably sobering and hard to read because he is coming to terms with the fact that he's about to die. And he's writing as a man about to die, and there was one section in particular that just gripped me. He said, "I am typing this, having just had an injection to try to reduce the pain in my arms, hands, and fingers. The chief side effect of this pain is numbness in the extremities, filling me with the not irrational fear that I will lose the ability to write. Without that ability, I feel sure in advance my will to live would be hugely attenuated. I often grandly say that writing is not just my living and my livelihood, but my very life, and it's true. Almost like the threatened loss of my voice, which is currently being alleviated by some temporary injections into my vocal folds, I feel my personality and identity dissolving as I contemplate dead hands and the loss of the transmission belts that cannot connect me to writing and thinking." This is what he's saying. He understood that, and he said very plainly, I don't even know who I am without being a writer. Who I am, my very identity, is so deeply anchored in who I am as a writer that without the ability to write, I feel my very personhood dissolving. So honest, so true. He could honestly answer the question, what if it were taken away from you today would make you conclude that life isn't worth living? He would say unabashedly, writing, I'm a writer. When our identity and our idolatry become one and the same, the prospect of death can only lead to unyielding despair. He was suffering under law. Somewhere along the way, he came to believe that if he was going to matter, he was going to have to establish his own identity, his own worth, his own value. That's the voice of law that says you have to make it happen. No one's going to do it for you. Therefore, you have to do it for yourself. That's one way of life. You can do it, but then it's all on your shoulders. You have to make it happen. You see, the law says you have to change your spouse if you're going to be happy. You have to control your kids if they're going to turn out okay. You have to be successful if you're ever going to satisfy the desire for human approval. The problem is, and this is why John 1 becomes a song of freedom for us. The problem is, down deep, we know that no matter how hard we try, we can't do it on our own, make it on our own, fix it ourselves. We can't ensure that life will go well, that our children will turn out okay, that people will like us, and as a result, our very existence will be validated. We can't ensure that. Without God, we're stuck trying to figure out on our own how to make things right, how to avoid the judgment of failure. And it's when we feel this weight of having to make it on our own, we slip into the slavery of self-salvation. We're going to have to do it. We're going to have to do it. We fall into the painful trap of trying to appease the judge, our friends, parents, spouse, ourselves, whatever. We fall into the painful trap of trying to appease the judge with hard work, good behavior, getting better, achievement, losing weight, and whatever. We conclude, if I can just stay out of trouble and get good grades, maybe my mom and dad will finally approve of me. If I can overcome this addiction, then maybe I can accept myself. If I can just get thinner, maybe my husband will finally think I'm beautiful and pay attention to me. If I can just help out more with the kids, maybe my wife won't criticize me as much. If I can make a name for myself and be successful, maybe I'll get the respect that I long for. It's the voice of law. It means that we ultimately fall into self-salvation projects. I got to do this. I got to make it happen. But as is always the case, self-salvation projects experientially eclipse the only salvation project that can set us free from this oppression. John 1 reveals another way, the only way. John 1 reveals the one who came to set us free from the pressure of having to fix ourselves, from having to measure up, the one who came to set us free from having to figure out how we're going to make something of ourselves, from the deep internal need to be right and rewarded and regarded and respected. We feel tremendous pressure to make those things happen for ourselves. And it's ruining our relationships. We have to win. We have to be on top. We have to get ahead. We have to be right. We have to be regarded. We have to be rewarded. We have to be respected. And it's killing us. It weighs heavy on our shoulders. Isn't it exhausting trying to control what other people think of us? Believing that if other people think well of us, I'll be able to accept myself. That's a subtlety of self-salvation. We do it all the time. And John 1 comes to show us something bigger, better, grander, another way, the only way that can ultimately set us free. These verses liberate us to acknowledge faults and failures without feeling like we're losing ourselves, because our identity is anchored in the strength and the victory of another. And so, grace upon grace, from His fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. All of the benefits that we long for are ours in Christ alone. Last weekend was the best weekend of my life. Okay, I'm just going to say it. It was the best weekend of my life. Okay? Gabe, Nate, and me went to Dallas. Now, I've been to Dallas. I go to Dallas 2 or 3 times a year, but this time was different. All right? We went specifically to hang out with the Dallas Cowboys. Okay? And as many of you know, that is the fulfillment of a lifelong dream for me. A love for the Dallas Cowboys is the only idol in my home that I encourage my children to feed and nurture. Okay, I say that is one idol that I think is okay to have, son. All right, I have it. So we went to Dallas, and it was amazing. I mean, because of some friends who set this up for us, we got to hang out with the players, and you know, it was just go to practice, be in the locker room, just conversate with players, meals with players, on the field, the whole deal. It was unbelievable. And the guy who ultimately made it happen was the chaplain of the team, who's a friend of mine. And this guy basically has an all-access pass to everyone and everything Dallas Cowboy. All right. So, we're walking around. My boys are walking around like they own the place. We're walking around the complex, locker room, field, stadium, you name it. We're walking around. Anytime someone would look at us a little bit funny, like, who are these people and what are they doing here? Are they allowed to be in here? We could say, I'm with him. and point to the chaplain, okay? The benefits the three of us received from this weekend and there were serious joys and benefits, okay? This is a big deal for us, so don't laugh it off like, This was a big deal for us, all right? Huge. I mean, I would literally pull up, okay, to the complex, and we see the players practicing in person. And we're standing there by the practice field. I mean, I just start tearing up. Like, this is a dream come true for me. And we've received some remarkable benefits, none of which had to do with who we were. Apart from this friend of mine, we had no access to the goods. None at all. We would have been locked out from all of the benefits that we received. But because I was able to say, I'm with him, all of the rights and all of the rewards that we receive, we knew had nothing to do with us. They don't know who we are from Adam. Some of them do because they listen to my sermons. But other than that, they don't have any power around there. The powers that be didn't know who we were. And so we were able to say, we're attached to him. And because we were attached to him, because we were attached to his fullness, we received all of the benefits that went along with what we experienced. Listen, the first Adam ventured up into the realm of things above and brought death. The second Adam ventured down into the realm of things below and brought life. The essence of sin is man substituting himself for God, while the essence of salvation is God substituting himself for man. Man asserts himself against God and puts himself where only God deserves to be. God sacrifices himself for man and puts himself where only man deserves to be. The incarnation of Jesus is God's answer to all of our enslaving self-salvation projects. It shouts that he has come. From above the sun, he's arrived. He's taken on human flesh and frailty to rescue us from the flesh and human frailty. He did it. He has borne the whole thing. And that is not only what we celebrate at Christmas, that we are no longer dependent on ourselves to make it happen. We attach ourselves to the one who came to make it happen for us. And just like Gabe, Nate, and me walking around Cowboys complex like we owned it, interacting with the players like they were family, just like that, we get all the benefits and rewards and joys that come our way because we're attached to the one who paid it all, who did it on behalf of those who couldn't. That's what we celebrate at Christmas. That's what we celebrate as a church when we celebrate communion. When we gather around the Lord's table, we are acknowledging that there's nothing we can do to make it happen on our own. There's nothing we can do to save ourselves. There's nothing we can do to fix ourselves. We come away with this great and glorious acknowledgement that Jesus came to do for us what we could never do for ourselves. Without Jesus breaking through, without the light breaking through the darkness, we would be left to our own devices. Unyielding despair is what we would be left with. And so when we take, we are taking with a heart posture of gratitude and thanksgiving. Not looking inside for the help that we need, but looking up and out to the help that has come, to that man's righteousness, to that man's cross, to that man's blood, to that man's death, to that man's arrival on behalf of sinners like you and me.